Hi, everyone. My name is David. I'm a technical writer at MongoDB, where I document some of our Gen AI products, as well as Atlas, our database platform. So yeah, in this talk, I want to just help us from a high level as writers understand how software practices are changing because of AI tooling, and how we can apply some of these new practices to the craft of writing documentation by using Docs as code as sort of a North Star. So to run through the talk agenda, so first we'll talk a bit about Docs as code, how this movement called vibe coding is changing what coding looks like. Then I'll move on to how we can learn from these changes and put them into practice as writers. And then finally discuss how to think about LLMs as this new reader and audience member for our docs. So to start things off with something where most of us are probably familiar with or are either practitioners of or implement this in our teams. Docs as code at its core is this idea that docs teams should follow the same processes and practices as development teams. So this means treating our docs like software. We write in some sort of markup language, which is a form of code in itself. We use the same tools for version control and collaboration, and we follow the same workflows and practices as our engineering counterparts, participating in reviews and other agile methodologies. So that's docs as code, but coding itself is fundamentally changing. So for those that haven't heard the term vibe coding, it's somewhat of a controversial topic, but it has emerged as this new approach towards development that is almost entirely accomplished through AI and natural language prompts. So essentially you can write a single prompt and create a full application. In this example, a game, website, sort of you name it, and you can kind of produce these results through the vibes, the magic of these powerful models. So although there are a slew of pitfalls and dangers to this approach that I won't get into in this talk, the proficiency of LLMs at writing code and the popularity of these vibe coding platforms and tools have really changed what coding looks like today, and in a lot of ways starting to resemble writing. So even though vibe coding isn't something that's replacing the job of developers, it is changing their workflows, and it's demonstrating how powerful AI-assisted coding can be. Enterprises and developers have rapidly adopted the same models and tools that power these vibe coders, from AI code editors like Cursor, GitHub Copilot, Claude Code, AI code review platforms, as well as AI mandates. These companies are telling engineers to use AI in their workflows and encouraging them to explore. Even some news from just today, Google announced Gemini CLI. So we're seeing how this AI tooling is becoming increasingly embedded into developer workflows. So developers are doing their jobs more efficiently and effectively, and my job is sort of thinking about how we can learn from this as writers. So if docs truly are code, as docs as code practitioners, we can reevaluate and adapt our own practices in a similar way and benefit from these AI tools. And a couple of questions I've been thinking about are, since coding is now becoming more about structured communication, writing is already about structured communication. So how can we take advantage of this in our own professions? And how can we work faster and amplify our expertise like developers are doing in these new practices today? So that brings me to the topic of AI-assisted writing. And hopefully I can shed some light on some of these questions. To kick things off, what AI tools to use? There's so many platforms and tools and models out there that offer pretty similar ways to interact with LLMs and to interface with them. But in my experience, none are as easy to learn and seamless to integrate with as AI-assisted code editors like GitHub Copilot and Cursor. At MongoDB, all of us have access to Copilot, so that's what I've been using. It basically allows you to stay in the same environment where you do a majority of your writing, and you can avoid context switching different windows, and you can get the benefits of LLMs right from your IDE, such as VS Code or whatever you're using. So on the right is sort of a screenshot of what this looks like. You have your file where you're composing your documentation. On the right, you have this chat interface where you can interact with Copilot or whatever AI code assistant you're using to make changes directly to your docs, ask questions, and perform tasks. And you also have access to various agentic tools like MCP servers to accomplish more complex workflows. And this kind of gets to that flow state that vibe coders are accustomed to. And so I highly recommend exploring these code editors as a tool as writers. So now that we're in the kitchen, let's make sure we have some guidelines before we just start generating anything and everything. And I think this is really where docs as code can come in handy and serve as a sort of North Star, a set of guardrails that can hold us accountable and make sure our AI use cases align with what development teams are actually doing. For example, no developer in your company is generating an entire feature from natural language and shipping to prod without some form of human intervention or manual coding. So similarly, we should not be generating entire sections of our docs and just shipping them out without thinking twice. Docs as code can be this way of protecting you from the pitfalls of LLMs in your writing. To cover just a handful of analogies, in these AI-assisted code editors, the AI learns and interacts with your code base. So you can see how this directly translates to our docs repositories. Code generation then becomes code example, text, API, metadata, and markup generation. Code review sort of becomes this copy review or style guide checking layer. And agentic tools that developers are starting to use for internal tasks. We can similarly explore running scripts, testing our code, and automating certain workflows using these agentic tools that are baked into AI code editors. These are just a handful of patterns that have emerged while I've experimented with these tools. A lot of other presenters have covered some of these, so I'll spare the details. But the first being natural language conversion. You take some sort of plain text and apply it to generate markdown, an API spec, etc. You can use the LLM to check for style. It's especially useful for pattern tasks, like a lot of speakers have mentioned. Sort of rinse and repeat, applying one change across several areas. That particularly is a huge productivity boost. And something that I'm exploring more is using some of these agentic capabilities to fully automate certain workflows and run scripts that can apply changes across our docs. The next piece of the puzzle is to save your prompts. When we work with LLMs, what do you think is the most valuable artifact? I think most folks would assume that it's the output, what the LLM produces. But I would actually argue that it's the input. Similar to how code doesn't tell you every decision an engineer made to implement a function in a certain way, in a piece of writing, it's difficult to understand the writer's intention simply from reading it. So therefore, when we are working with generated content and we're happy with the result, it's very important to retain the steps you took with the LLM so that you and your team can reproduce what you did. So saving, standardizing, and iterating on these prompts allows us to share our findings and work more efficiently in this new AI-driven world of productivity. So there's a lot out there on prompt engineering, one or few shot prompting, chain of thought. Tom just mentioned, adding more context to your prompts, and I think this is a basic pillar that can really improve the quality of your responses. So really quick, here's a basic demo of what this might look like. On the left, I have a very rough natural language outline of a tutorial on running a basic MongoDB query. On the right, I have an existing tutorial that I'm going to put into Copilot as context. And I also have a prompt that I just dragged into the context window filled with all of our restructured text markup components. And so this is particularly a pain point for our team because restructured text is very finicky about spacing and we have a lot of custom components. But Copilot is very adept at taking these components and understanding the syntax and applying it to natural language. So we'll see the success of Copilot here. Next, I have a prompt that contains a very condensed version of our style guide. And so Copilot is going to suggest a handful of suggestions like using present tense, using active voice, some more tactile guidance that is sort of restrained by the scope of our original prompt. Next, to show the agentic capabilities of Copilot, I'm testing the actual query that I've documented by using our MongoDB MCP server, which allows us to go beyond the scope of the LLM by giving it access to these tools, which are essentially executable functions, such as running MongoDB queries. And so what I'm doing here is taking the output of the tool call and updating the original documentation to reflect the actual output. So we're seeing how these agentic capabilities can be used for testing. And this all goes back to the idea of staying within the same environment as you're writing. This is a very similar interface that a lot of vibe coders are working with. So as a final piece of the puzzle, we're generating a PR and pushing these changes. And so at the end of all this, we have our completed and fully rendered page. And to round things off, I want to talk a bit about LLMs as this new audience member of ours and what to make of it as writers. The first question that I've been seeing pop up a lot is this notion of writing for robots or writing for LLMs. Half of this discussion seems to deal with SEO and discoverability, which for the purposes of this talk doesn't necessarily impact the craft of writing itself. We can add metadata and keywords, but this doesn't represent a substantive shift in our approach. The other half of this discussion seems to focus more on making your docs more clear, more obvious, correct, and up to date. So that kind of begs the question, is good docs for LLMs any different than good docs for humans? I think everyone might have their own answer to that, but an approach that I've been thinking about is writing for other writers who use LLMs on your team. So one of the biggest dangers of AI and LLMs is this notion of garbage in, garbage out. So if your source content is poorly written, the generated content on top of it will inevitably also be. So it then becomes a matter of ensuring your docs are good to begin with and following a clear pattern that a human can follow and therefore an LLM can follow. As for some basic pillars, staying aligned with your team, writing consistently and explicitly, organizing your docs with intention, both at the page level and at a file structure level. What's intuitive to us will likely be intuitive for LLMs in terms of pattern recognition moving forward. And finally, using AI to reproduce and multiply your efforts, particularly through prompts and any other use cases that start to emerge. Although the content itself might not necessarily be substantially different, LLMs are still accessing this content and developers are using LLMs and AI interfaces to learn. And so very quickly at MongoDB, we've been exploring this challenge. Well over a year ago, we put out our chatbot, which is powered by our very own vector search product to implement RAG. We also just released LLMs.txt and markdown pages for individual pages, so developers can kind of plug and play the docs into their AI interfaces and tools. All this to say, we're seeing a shift from docs as static sites for human readers to knowledge bases for LLMs. One additional method of exposing our docs to LLMs that is particularly interesting now, and I think we'll see this more and more, is MCP servers, especially for developer-focused documentation providers. I won't go into the details of MCP, but we're essentially exposing our content to agentic AI interfaces through primarily tool calls, but there are other abstractions such as prompts and resources to help you interact with docs from your AI interfaces. So as a quick demo, a few members at MongoDB and I put together this MCP server that contains some condensed product guides, as well as a retrieval tool that performs RAG to get semantically relevant chunks from our docs. So in this first example, we have a single prompts on generating a Python script using our vector search product. And LLMs don't have access to this information as far as I know. It's relatively new compared to a lot of the training data cutoffs for LLMs. But by providing our docs as context, it's able to generate a fully runnable script in one single prompt. And so by giving AI our docs, this will reduce hallucinations, make developers happy, and obviously make vibe coders very happy as well. The second tool is performing a basic retrieval from our docs, running that tool. And this just represents another alternative way of interacting with our docs and learning as a developer. So the possibilities are kind of endless for what kind of tools you might want to have. You can envision complete tutorials can be accomplished in a single prompt. Here's a quick chart of evaluations that show that providing LLMs with good docs leads to better outcomes. So it's pretty reassuring to know that our docs really do make a difference. Just to round things out, quick summary. We can learn from emerging AI practices in software and apply them to docs by using docs as code as a North Star. We can use AI to improve our productivity by applying it to pattern tasks and sharing our prompts across the team. So this means spending more time actually writing and focusing on high-level tasks. And docs are increasingly important as the knowledge base for LLMs and alternate publishing methods will arrive. So that's all. Thank you for listening, and for the organizers putting on this event. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email. I would love to meet you all.